Welcome to everybody who's here. We'll wait just 1 or 2 more minutes to allow other participants to join. Okay, the numbers seem to have stabilized, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello and thank you. Welcome. This is the IRIS International Book Club event, and our guest speaker this month will be Zara Chaudhry, who will give a talk on the Night Diary, the Partition of South Asia through Literature. Today's event is co-sponsored by IRIS and the UW-Madison Center for South Asia, and Carmen and Essie will post additional upcoming IRIS outreach events in the chat, and we will also announce these at the end of today's session. My name is Sarah Beckham, and I will serve as the moderator for the event today. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for South Asia and a linguist by training. One of my current projects looks at the dialect changes in post-partition Pakistani Punjabi, so I'm very excited to participate in this event and learn from our speaker. I'd also like to acknowledge Essie Lenchner, who will be providing tech support for this event. If you have any questions, please enter those into the chat if you're having any issues. And as far as the format of our event will go today, the speaker will give her talk, and you can feel free to put any of your questions in the chat or in the Q&A during the talk or after the talk, and we will moderate the questions. Just note that this event is being recorded. Any contributions to the chat will not be recorded, but if you do turn on your video or audio, that will appear in the recordings. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Zara. Zara Chaudhry is a lecturer of Hindi here in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at UW-Madison. She is also a multilingual writer and instructor with an MA Writing for Performance from the University of Leeds and an MFA in Creative Writing and Environment from Iowa State University. She has previously worked as a copyright and assistant editor, run a digital film production studio, and was one of 6 storytellers in a writer's room for the Indian movie studio Eros International. Her more recent work has focused on sci-fi and speculative literature, Holocaust writing and imagery, and theater direction. She won the Pearl Hogref Award in Creative Nonfiction in 2019, the MVICW Fellowship for Parent Writers in 2018, and in 2019, she worked with Turner Classic Movies in an original production to write and produce documentaries for an on-air broadcast. The languages that she enjoys working with and in are Hindi, Urdu, Gujarati, Punjabi, Tamil, and French. So thank you, Zara, and everyone, please help me give a warm welcome to Zara Chaudhry.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. This is my first time with IRIS and just my first real event on campus here. So I'm really excited to see everybody. And I hope that you've enjoyed this book as much as I have. I just wanted to start off by thanking IRIS for having me and for the Center for South Asia. Nancy, Carmen, Essie, Leslie, Sarah, thank you for organizing this and inviting me to come be a part of it. I'm really excited to hear how you've all liked this book and what crept up for you as you're reading it, how this story has connected to other stories around the globe that you might have encountered or are interested in. And I really look forward to that exchange at the end of it. But I have a short presentation here to really take us through the what I see in the book, and I hope this makes sense to all of you. So, just to sort of add to what Sarah said, my interest in this book is both as a person from South Asia and as a writer, as somebody who sees fiction and memoir as vehicles through which we can tell the stories that are stories of trauma, stories of grief, stories of separation, and how fiction allows us to do that. I'm also a mother myself, and to a child who is on the verge of being in middle school. So I really appreciated that that's the audience this book speaks to, and I'm interested in hearing everyone else's perspectives on that. Um, there's also a few other books and literature that I will be drawing connections with, which might not be from South Asia, but they're from my interests in sci-fi and dystopia and sort of um, stories of thriving and surviving through conflict. So as I bring those up, feel free to put questions in the chat or comments if you've read it and you think that you understand or are interested in seeing that connection a little more. So with that, I will start now. So The Night Diary by Veera Hiranandani. Uh, the way I think about this book is that it is the story of the partition, and it's a very close, sort of zoomed in look at a person's separation from home and therefore their separation from self. So, to begin with, I picked three pieces of literature that some of you might be familiar with. One, if not all, of all three of these, which is Anne Frank's The Diary of a Young Girl, Khaled Hosseini's The Kite Runner, and then Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. And I'll show you why I think these are the books that sort of really stood out to me. Um, so this book, The Night Diary, is very much written in that epistolary fashion. It is a direct address. And the direct address can become a very powerful tool, especially when you have a narrator who has secrets or has secret desires, but are not yet self aware to understand how interiority and that internal voice works. And so it's pretty much why Anne Frank's diary too speaks to us across generations and across decades, is because it has that sort of direct address to an intermediary. There is this mute other, there's somebody in between us and the narrator, um, who's like a stand-in for us. So in a sense, they're almost directly speaking with us. It's a dialogue. And that becomes a very powerful way for books like this to really reach a younger audience. I also thought that um, I saw Nisha, the main central character, the protagonist, really be able to understand and grapple with what she was going through as she wrote in her diary. It's an experience again that a lot of us at that age have thought about, have written, have gone through. And journaling and diary writing very much is that first stage of self-awareness in the young mind. And I think that that's the sort of craft tool that Hiranandani decides to, that choice she takes to make sure that we really get a sense of the internal world and the storm within Nisha, as much as the world outside her is this environment of conflict. There's also the very clear storyline of Nisha not speaking up and not really having a voice outside. She very rarely actually is seen in dialogue with anybody in her house. And so her diary becomes that voice, and it helps us to familiarize ourselves with how she sounds when she's not being watched. There's also the very visceral act of writing in diaries. The fact that she packs a pencil and the diary with her, and that for many days, even once they leave home, she continues to write. There's something rebellious and courageous in just the act of expressing. And it's a very hard thing to do for all of us who have ever decided or thought of, I'm going to write down this thing that is in my head or this idea. We know how intimidating that can be. And so there is power in the very act of writing. And that's what makes her a compelling narrator and voice. The final thing is that she, unlike Anne, isn't saying Dear Diary. She's writing to her mother. And so the book essentially becomes the vehicle through which we understand Faria, the mother, because now we're seeing this daughter paint and sort of fill in her portrait through this book as she goes along. The other book that this really reminded me a lot of was Khaled Hosseini's The Kite Runner. Now, The Kite Runner came out right after the Taliban had taken over Afghanistan. And it is essentially the story of another young child and his friendship back in Kabul, and how when he leaves, he has to leave that friend behind. And with him, he's leaving home, he's leaving relationships. Um, and again, because it's told through the innocence and the quiet voice of a younger narrator, it allows for certain vulnerabilities that we don't allow ourselves as adults when we write and we tell stories and we talk about it. We're more willing to sort of divulge certain secrets. Um, the filters are dropped for a little while. So I think that was why I made this sort of connection between these two very compelling books. There's also the fact that children, when they speak and when they write, tend to write more in terms of what they've seen and don't spend as much time interpreting things. They just observe and directly state it. And that makes for a lot of authenticity. It's almost what we're taught in journalism school to do, right? Um, and so you start to see this world in relation to that idea of self that the child holds. What do they see as their identity? What is their house like? What does the playground they play at look like? Who are their friends? What do their parents call them? What do they call their parents? And similarly, in the night diary, you're only seeing Papa and Dadi. You never really hear or see their names. But that's what they become to us. They become Papa and Dadi and Amil and Kazi and all of these people. And so the sense of self is developing and growing there. And I thought that that was very richly worked through the night diary as well. There's also the senses. There's all of the sights and the sounds and the smells, which become part of who we are. For Nisha especially, that's very, very vibrant. Her world is a world that is very colorful and noisy, and there's people and there's all of these different um, tensions between sounds, between smells, between who is allowed to do what in the house, between items and materials. And you can see how the author uses that to sort of build Nisha's sense of her place in this world. Where does she, if there were a hierarchy, or if this was a dinner table really of different items of food, where was she placed? What is she? Is she, one thing or the other? Um, there's also the idea of how children build these bonds. So Kazi, for instance, is the servant in the house, the cook and the servant. Um, and her bond with him is built from out of a very deep sense of longing for knowing a parent that she has lost, but also from just this one person who gets her, who listens to her, who has a straightforward conversation with her. And both the Kite Runner and the Night Diary seem to have that in common. And then the biggest question in these narratives is about the privilege of leaving. So, as much as Nisha and her family are survivors in the story, for all of us who have survived riots or turmoil or the partition, and I have a history in my own family of this, which I will speak a little more of later. Uh, but when you survive, there's also what Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, called the burden of guilt of surviving, and the idea that there were others who didn't make it, and what differentiates the people who make it from the ones who didn't. What was different about one person or one family's journey that didn't work out for somebody else. And especially when you go through these experiences when you're younger, there is guilt plays a very different role with children and the way that they process it. And I think a lot of the richness of this book is seeing this 12-year-old girl trying to process both the fear and the immediate sense of needing to survive, the instinct, but also carrying this burden of, wait, what am I leaving behind? Who am I leaving behind? What will happen to them? And why do I get to get away and they don't? And that again was very similar with the Kite Runner. Um, I felt at many points while reading this book like I was reading a memoir, and I'd be interested in hearing if others felt that way too. And she says in her notes as well that it is sort of based on, but or draws heavily from her family's own experiences with the partition. And I was just really interested in the sort of material sense of the book and how rich and how populated it was with materiality. So whether it is, what are the things that she remembers of her mother, of what the house was like before, or just her struggle to try and remember. Like she's struggling for that touch of her mother's skin. She's struggling to remember when her father last laughed. But there's also more tangible things, the painting, the hand and the egg, the mortar pestle, the rooms that her mother lived in that she doesn't want to leave. These are all physical items, and part of fleeing, part of having to leave home means separating yourself from the materials that build your sense of identity. Um, it's hard to get children to empathize with that, even for us as adults to empathize with what that separation means until you really go through it. And this is one of those stories where you really see her holding on and clutching on to simple, basic, everyday items which define her routine life. Because life back, once she moves to Jodhpur, once she moves to India, is not going to be life, childhood, normalcy as Nisha recognized it. Um, and then there is the invisible burdens too of, what do you carry? And this is why I thought of Tim O'Brien's story collection, The Things They Carried, which is about the Vietnam War, but it's about soldiers. And in a strange sense, that's very similar when you go off to war to somewhere far away and you don't know if you're coming back. It's sort of this like one-way ticket. And a refugee's journey is similar. It's very much like you don't know if you're going to reach this final destination. You can hope you will, but you don't know. Uh, and O'Brien talks about the items, and the story works as a list almost of all the small things that different soldiers decide to put in their packs, and what they carry, what does that remind them of, who does that remind them of, while they're facing the ugliness of death and war and violence in front of them. And there was this very strong parallel that I saw with that and Nisha's story too, because in carrying this heavy sort of kitchen item with her in her small little backpack, she's trying to take all the things that Kazi taught her, all the flavors of her childhood. Um, and she's also carrying the hope that she might be able to cook like that. She might be able to still take that remnant forward with her. So that I thought was very interesting. And then the word itself, the partition. In Hindi, we say batwara for the partition. And partition to me seems very apt and very sort of apropos to how the British saw it, because when they came in, they essentially had a gentleman called Radcliffe who had apparently never been east of Paris. sat in London, drew a line, and that line became the border that split this whole subcontinent into um, two countries. So it's easy to think of, oh, well, yes, this border appeared overnight, and suddenly you had two nations where one stood before. But for South Asians, given our huge sense of just family and togetherness, and the idea of, even today we have joint families where we have multi-generational homes. We live with extended uncles and aunts and cousins. We grow up with them in the same house. When you talk about Batwara, that is literally as if someone were to sort of put a wall through the center of your house and have your uncles and aunts live across, and not be able to reach them through that wall as easily. You can't just walk into people's, rooms anymore, and you can't have your evening chai together, and you don't share those stories, even though your stories are the same. So it's a lot more painful, the idea of the Batwara, as versus when we think about it as the partition, which is just this event in history that was bloody and millions of people got displaced. This is very much like the tearing apart of a family. So here's where I thought I could tell you a little bit about my own family's experience. My grandfather grew up in Punjab, which is also in that same northwest belt of India and Pakistan. Nisha's family is in Sindh, which is southeast from there. My grandfather was in the north in Punjab. And these were again fields. They were like, you have your cornfields everywhere here. We had mustard and potato fields that my grandfather grew up in. And then one day they were told that this line goes through their land, and they will get more land if they move to the other side because they're Muslim, but they have to give up this. And so his mother and siblings decided to move, but my grandfather decided that he wanted to stay in India because he wanted an education. He did not want to go um, be a farmer again with the rest of his family. And so the family separated and they didn't see each other for 21 years, which just boggles my mind to like not see your mother for 21 years. But you can't, it's not easy to get visas. You can't really travel across the border as easily. So there are real families that were ravaged and separated by this. And of course, there were entire families that had to lose everything and move. So the idea of the partition itself, even today, is sort of this intergenerational trauma that seeps down to our children, our grandchildren. We're all aware of it. We don't talk about it as much in our homes, but it's very much a reality of what we used to be, what our ancestors used to have, and what we don't. In that same vein, I would really encourage everyone to take a look at the Museum of Material Memory. It is by an author and oral historian, Aanchal Malhotra, and she has traveled across the border, both countries, Bangladesh too, and she has looked at material history and made this whole collection. So if at some point you're presenting this book to your students, this might be an interesting way for them to study and look at items and stories connected to items a little more. This is a little quote from Malhotra's book, Remnants of a Separation. If I considered the partition an archaeological site, and the many experiences of those who witnessed it as the site's structural sedimentation, then the deeper I excavated, the more I found, and that too in innumerable renditions. And that's part of the story here with Nisha's family too, that there are these interconnected stories of Nisha's mother knowing Kazi, both of them being Muslim, her grandmother and her father having made up and come back together after he decided to marry somebody outside the faith. And so there's these layers of history over which each generation and each event is building. Food in the Night Diary. I think food also plays this integral part in most stories of where we're trying to hold on to history and trying to bring back or contain an idea or an era in a culture. And the relationship that Nisha and Kazi build together, I think, is the one that stands out the most when it comes to food and the sort of sharing that happens there. But there's also food as expression. That scene where he shows her how to sort of smack at the door and take out all that she's feeling, and she uses it as a time and a moment to express herself, is very real. We have stories in our, I mean, we've grown up around kitchens where we would see our mom sometimes really whack the door because she was having a really bad day. Um, and you would, almost, we'd say it in Hindi to her that, don't take it out on it just because somebody is like, your mother-in-law screamed at you or whatever. Um, and so food as expression is, again, a very visceral and very sort of organic way that this story moves along. The fact that she also carries a sign of the food with her, but she also learns, she carries the knowledge of the food with her. And it comes in handy when they later on have to build a fire and cook out in a remote place on their way out. I thought that really spoke to the fact that even though she was the silent observer, even though she was always in the background and sort of in the shadows watching her family, Nisha was imbibing all of this into herself. She was acquiring this knowledge quietly, and it had to come back and help the family later on. It made me think of Lauren, the protagonist in Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. Lauren is taught by her father how to make bread out of acorn, and it's a climate fiction novel that you might also be interested in showing your students. And it's in a world where nothing much grows other than acorn trees. And so, how once she hits the road on this long, arduous journey, she knows she carries this knowledge within her body, and that helps her to survive, and it helps her help her community to survive. And that to me seems the same thing in the same way that Nisha is doing. She's essentially helping her family get through every night when she understands how food is to be made. Um, there's also Primrose from the Hunger Games, who has a sense of healing, who knows what herbs to use and what grows where, and she's the grower and the healer. And I think that food plays a gamut of roles in the story beyond just the dinner table and the fact that a family comes together around it. So I spoke a little bit about why this felt memoirish in the beginning, and how thin that line really is between something that is memoir and autobiographical and something that's fictional. So books which are directly about lived experience, that is memoirs or biographies or autobiographies, and then books that are fiction but inspired from lived experience, they both depend on the same thing, the authenticity of the voice. Now, the reason I think Nisha ends up being so authentic and believable is because A, she's a young female character. In the story, she is the underdog. She's often overlooked. She's told, you don't know anything, stay out of this, don't ask questions. She's shut out of most rooms within the story. And this somehow makes her more reliable, more trustworthy, more unbiased as a narrator. And we're more willing to believe her than, say, if the father were telling the story or the dadi was telling the story. There's also the complexity of telling both sides of the story. Most literature, most fiction, most film material out there about the partition has to be sieved and filtered for bias, because it is such a contentious and painful part of our history that it's very easy to push that line and make it more about one side and not equally understand that both sides and all sides really suffered. And it seems to me that in making the parents interfaith, a Muslim mother and a Hindu father, she could open through and break through certain doors where bias was getting in the way. And she could constantly question and ask, but what happens to that other side of me? Am I less Muslim? Am I more Hindu? Do I have to give up one? Can I still belong to both? Because both are, in such a primal way, they're part of who she is. Um, and that's essentially what the conflict between India and Pakistan even today feels like. It essentially feels like children fighting over the same two parents. We joke in India sometimes when every time we come to the brink of war with Pakistan, that it just feels like we're caught in a bad divorce. But that's essentially how I think by making both parents two of the two faiths, she manages to overcome that expectation or that preconceived notion of there might be bias in the story. And I think that's where the fictionalizing has allowed her to extend that humanity. I would presume in this too that even when you are being given oral stories and histories by your parents and grandparents who've been through this, there is going to be that implicit sense of victimhood and surviving something, and the other becomes the monster. And so that's where I think that line has to finally be drawn and said, well, I'm going to fictionalize this so that we can really open up those voices and listen to all sides. The people really, and excuse my poor scrawls across the screen, but I was essentially trying to think of how we know all of these people, as I said, in connection to Nisha. We know them based on how they behave with her. Amil seems to have a very brotherly, protective, but also slightly contentious relationship. They fight like most normal brothers and sisters do. He also thinks of her as like younger and therefore not doesn't know enough. Papa and Nisha, there is love, but he seems to hold back and he seems to not want to express it as openly. You can tell this is a man who's still grieving the loss of his wife. Dadi seems to be in that sort of gray area. She's not your quintessential loving grandmother. She's more very much still the mother-in-law of your mother who's now passed on. And so there is some love and there is some affection, but she's not the person that Nisha can go to either. Yet there's a lot of protectiveness and pride, and especially the scenes in which the Dadi hides them in the pantry and covers for them and is praying and muttering prayers is very evocative. And then, of course, Mama, who she writes the diary to, we never really get a full picture of her. We know and we're very clear that what we're seeing is a child's longing for the mother, not the mother herself. And then, of course, we see Kazi and Nisha's relationship, which is this pure, innocent bond of um, finding companionship and meaning at a time where both are alone. But I was more interested also in the relationships that these characters shared with each other. So the slight sort of toxicity of Amil and Papa's relationship, where it's a father who's not willing to understand his son and a son who really wants to be accepted by this man. He sees a hero in him, but therefore he also pulls back because he knows he's going to be shirked away. There's Dadi and Amil's relationship. There's Papa and Dadi's relationship that I really wondered about. How did this woman accept her son running off to marry somebody from another faith in a country where this is highly frowned upon, where love marriages are frowned upon and arranged marriages are the way to go? How did she reconcile and come back? Did she come back when the mother died? How does she look at these two children because they're half her and half her son? I thought about Mama and Dadi's relationship as well. What was it like? Did she know of this girl that her son was in love with? What was that like? What did she approve or disapprove of her? And then Mama and Kazi's relationship, because again, these were both people who were joined by their common faith, but then they were separated by class. One was the employer and one was the servant. And how did they bridge that gap? And was food the thing that brought them together, or was it faith, or was it that she thought that he somehow knew that he would be looking after her children even after she was gone? So there's a lot to wonder about in those other secondary characters and their relationships too. And then the place itself. So I knew very little about Mirpur Khas. Before this, I do know of Sindh, because just the Sindhi culture is a very rich and vibrant culture in India and, of course, in Pakistan, where the actual region exists. And it was really interesting for me to see her obsession with mangoes, because apparently when I looked it up, Mirpur Khas is not known to be the city of mangoes. They're known for the Sindriam or the Sindri mangoes, which they're very proud of. I come from a part of India, but part of me comes from a part of India that is known for the Alfonso mango, and we call it the king of all mangoes. So there's a lot of debate about which one is the best variety. And apparently they have 232 varieties of mangoes just in Mirpur Khas. But there were other very interesting things that I found out about the place. The fact that this city happens to be only 170 miles away from the border. And so after independence, because of the railway lines being so close, it was the first city to welcome refugees and immigrants who were coming from India, Muslims who were coming to live in Pakistan. It also happened to have lesser violence than what Punjab and other parts of Pakistan and India saw at the time. And just Sindhi culture in general is it's a very rich, vibrant culture of music, song, food, clothing, housing, and sort of even religiously, even though there's Hindu Sindhis and Muslim Sindhis, there's a lot that they share. So, for instance, I have Hindu friends in India who are Sindhis and who would just sort of break out and say, hi Allah when you want to say, oh God, or and Allah for most people would be Muslim in terms of, saying, oh God, but you easily hear both sides saying it because that's just the language of Sindh. And so you recognize that wherever you go in India, you speak to someone and you start connecting with them based on both of you being Sindhi as versus one person being Hindu and the other being Muslim. I don't know how, if that makes sense. But yeah, even today, there's an estimated 33% of the population there that are Hindu. I had a little audio clip because the sound of the language is beautiful, and I thought it'd be really nice for you guys to hear it. I'm just going to play it for a quick minute here and take a listen. So More Totile is just a Sufi song from there. And again, that region and Punjab, they're all known for Sufi music, which again transcends religious boundaries. We all sort of believe and share the same sort of spirituality for that kind of music. So again, there's so many of these frayed threads culturally between the two sides. And you really feel it firsthand and up close because Nisha becomes the vessel through which we're seeing this world. The road itself, I was very surprised when the story sort of jumps forward after India's independence, after 15th of August. And you see this family traveling across the border and all the different stages of that journey. And it made me think about, well, what are the things that she does choose to show us? And she shows us this family and its trials in transit, the sort of harrowing train journey and the scenes of tension and the sort of near death experiences on the train, the hunger and thirst that they experience, people who choose not to give them water, and then those that do help them, the rain and the sort of feeling like that's miraculous and that somehow her mother helped make that happen. And then the time that they spend at Rashid uncle's house, at her maternal uncle's house, her small and brief friendship with Hafa. Um, And then it made me think of what don't we see? Because again, as somebody from that part of the world, I have been exposed since a very young age to images of violence and the brutality of that time. um, if you're saying more than 2 million people died and millions were displaced, and there's all of these figures, then how do you grapple with that not being in the book? And I can see why, because, well, it's for a younger audience and it's for middle school children, but it's also the question of what you repress. And I think Nisha addresses that in her last few diary entries, where she says that I don't want to say, and I don't know how much I remember, and I don't know how much I want to tell of what I remember. And that's a very clear survivor sense of moving on, and just a sense of I will not be able to live if I remember the things that I saw and went through. And it's important, even though it's not explicitly written in the story, to point readers in that direction and make them look at that gap of what is missing, what is the information that has been held back, and why. What does that journey do to shape a person, to break down a person, and then how do they build themselves and their sense of selves from there? And I can see that by the end of it, Nisha does recognize that they went through something that they were courageous to get through, that was brave of them. Um, but there's a huge sense of something terrible and a sense of loss that took place in that journey. So I think it's important to sort of poke and prod at that gap a little bit, and see what comes up for children. And then I wanted to quickly also think about the cover itself, because I just thought it was a beautiful cover. Um, but it brought a couple of ideas up for me. I mean, obviously there's the fact that there are these pairs of hands that are reaching across a gulf and across this chasm, and they're trying to reach out. And then there's the beautiful night sky in the background. And the night sky just immediately made me think of Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech, which was the speech he gave on the night that India and Pakistan attained their freedom. And he said, while the world is asleep, India awakens to beauty and freedom. And there are a lot of images of people sort of with their radios to their ear, listening to this man's voice far away in Delhi, announcing something, making a proclamation of something that would affect their own real lives on the ground. And that's a beautiful speech to maybe perhaps accompany the book in a reading of it. But it's also the fact that freedom comes at midnight, and that in those quiet hours and in that sort of secretive time of the day, you get something, you gain something that is so life altering and changing, and it shifts um, entire worlds for all of this population in the subcontinent. And I thought that that's a very powerful sort of image, that choice that was made here. There's also the fact that Nisha, through the diary, is reaching out to her mother, but a mother that is dead. And so this is, the night acts as that in between time as well, right? Where the living and the spirits sort of come together, at least in a lot of our mythologies in South Asia, it does. Um, and so that idea of hands reaching across time, across mortality, and finding solace, finding companionship, was something that I really felt as I read this book. The duration as well. I think with diaries, it's easy to sort of give you entries every few months, and sort of something that lasts over a really long time. But there's an immediacy in how quickly the story is told. It's a few days before August 14th and 15th, and then it goes on for just a few months after. And it really shows you how that's all it takes sometimes to tear apart an entire nation and reconfigure what that's going to look like for billions of people that live there and call it home. Um, there's also the fact that as much as it is Nisha reaching out for her long passed away mother, this book seems to be creating that conversation between two sides that have, in some sense, stopped talking. that only speak from within their own bubbles of their own experience, and have othered, sometimes monsterized the other, and have stopped speaking. And I think of this in a global sense as well, of what are the groups that have a shared history of violence and pain, and what are some of the ways that these conversations can be bridged, and how do you see what we call apnapan in Hindi, the oneness, the belonging with the other side. Um, and then, of course, the fact that we're unfortunately living in a time where we're inundated with stories of loss of home, loss of self, of separation. We've been seeing this in the last decade or so, but we've really been living with these stories for so long. And to me, Nisha's story helps really bring home that nobody willingly leaves their house to go be an asylum seeker, an immigrant, or a refugee somewhere else. All of us would rather live in our own homes, sleep in our own beds, eat the food that we grew up eating, smell the smells that we belong to, and the land that we belong to. But there are these circumstances, all of which are external, that force you to be in these other places. Um, and then what does that mean? What does it mean when you've already felt broken down, deconstructed in so many ways, and then you still don't belong in a new place? So it's the after of the story that we also have to think about. Of, does Nisha ever feel at home in India the way she felt in Mirpur Khas? Does she ever completely ascribe to that identity as she did? What does India mean for her? And these are questions we could ask of children coming out of Syria, Rohingya refugees, of people who are coming into the US from Central America. There's these stories are all across and all around us. And as I was thinking about this and writing about it, this Hindi song kept playing in my head, from a movie called Refugee. And the lyrics essentially say, Panchi nadiyan pavan ke jhoke, koi sarhad na inhe roke, sarhad insano ke liye hai, socho tumne aur maine kya paya insan hoke. And it essentially translates as, the birds, rivers, the wafting gentle breeze, no border can stop these. Borders of the humans, wonder what you and I gained by being human. And so just reflecting on that as an idea of what have we done to our shared humanity by drawing these lines and keeping people out, or holding people in, um, is something to think about. Here's a list of films, because I come from a background in film. I just thought quickly off the top of my head once I finished reading the book, what are some of the films that can really help students and young people, teenagers, really try and understand what the partition was like. The first 5 films on the list, Pinjar, Train to Pakistan, Earth, Garam Hawa, and then Toba Tek Singh, and are just stories by Manto, who was a famous partition time writer. But those 5 are essentially about the partition itself. And then the rest, Refugee, Veer, Zara, Begum Jan, Happy Bhag Jayegi, Razi, these are just films that are contemporary ways of still sort of reaching across the border and trying to see what we share in common. Some of them are comedies, some of them are just are romances. One of them is sort of like a feminist story. Another one is a spy thriller. But these are just, I think our film industries and our creative industries in both countries are still trying to build that bridge and to keep us in conversation with each other, because we do have so much in common. And I think a lot of people would find these stories just enlightening and entertaining. But I hope all of this material helps in understanding and appreciating what this time in history means to people in South Asia, but also the sort of ripples that that sends out across our diaspora, and I think also globally in the bigger context. That's it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Zara, for this incredible talk and for enhancing our understanding of this teaching tool, this novel, with your very personal and intimate family history, as well as your craft as a writer. This was incredible, and I speak for everyone. If anyone would like to begin by putting questions in the chat, I'll go ahead and start reading some of the comments which people have been writing during the presentation. Marie says, I love the way that you're bringing the culture and people to life with so many amazing images and how you create them with your words. Amazing presentation. Number of people affirming this as well. Essie also mentions that this bridges very wonderfully with last week's event on the movie Earth. So for those of you who are interested, please do feel free to contact Assistant Director of Iris, Carmen Pitts, for the materials for last week's event, if you're interested in bridging together this with culturally responsive teaching of partition in film through film. And Carmen has just added her email address to the chat. Do we have any questions? If also, you can feel free to turn on your microphone or your camera if anyone has any. I guess I'll go ahead and start with a question then while people are still thinking through. I really loved how you mentioned what has not been mentioned or what has been withheld in this novel, and also the way in which the narrator sort of lacks interpretation, right? And this is, I recall this at the beginning of the novel where she just is sort of listing off like Nehru, Jinnah, Mountbatten.
Yeah.
How do we use this as an educational tool to maybe not simplify communal violence or communalism, that can sometimes, as you mentioned, right, partition can be talked about in a very unnuanced way.
Right, yeah.
So how do we contextualize that?
I mean, I think there's a lot of wonderful material on all of these gentlemen you just named, Jinnah and Gandhi and Nehru and Mountbatten too. There's films, there's books, and a lot of very nuanced journalism about them. Photographs too. I think photographs especially help in creating that sense of presence and having been there, which sometimes in writing you can just lose that in between the lines. But I think what is important to remember is the fact that these were all a group of freedom fighters who fought against the British, that they came together to overthrow this colonial power. And that somehow that sort of last whiplash of that colonial power leaving was that this friendship scattered. And that is, it's a very simplistic way, but I think it's the easiest way to understand how all of these well-meaning, well-intentioned people that sacrificed so much for the greater good then sort of fell apart towards the end of it.
Thank you. And I think that leads very nicely to the next question by Kristen, which is, what is the relationship between India and Pakistan like today? I know it's not great, but what are the thoughts for the future?
So, I mean, it's definitely not a pretty picture. We've had several wars since the partition. We're always at loggerheads. Our cricket matches are insane amount of stress and tension for both sides. Very high stakes. Everything about the two countries is very high stakes. They're also both nuclear powers, which makes it even more scary in today's world. I think when it comes to people, there is still a sense of nostalgia and fondness. I think the Material Memory Project museum can show you how we have that sense of, well, we speak the same language, we eat the same food, we still have the love. And Bollywood tends to really bridge and bring the two worlds together. But politically, it seems to me as if both sides use the other one when they don't want to focus on their own problems internally. And we've been going back and forth with that for decades. Every time we are in an economic crisis and we turn to our political leaders, they'll point at Pakistan and say, look, there's a terrorist attack. And Pakistan seems to do the same thing. It also doesn't help that there's such a big Muslim population in India. who are constantly questioned about their sense of belonging and whether they consider themselves Indians, or why didn't they go off to Pakistan, and their loyalty is constantly questioned. So that's a huge tension between the two countries as well. I could speak for another 40 minutes about it. Yeah.
Thank you. Kristen has asked for the list of films which Leslie has posted in the chat, and Carmen will also be sending those out tomorrow in the post-event materials email, which will, I believe, include a folder or a link to all of the materials for today's event. And then Emra also includes in the chat the 1947 Partition archive, which may or may not be included in the list of resources being distributed tomorrow, but I would also recommend that people take a look at that. That is a really incredible resource for teaching partition.
I just added it to the web, the web folder. So it'll be a digital resources. So there are several PDFs that we included about teaching the book, in addition to all of the recommendations from Zara on the different films. And so all of that is available in the digital resources. So you'll get a post-event email tomorrow that'll have a link to that Google folder so that you can explore those.
Thank you, Carmen. And we'll take one final question before we wrap up with final announcements. So Christine asks, this is a broad question. Decades later, how have both sides of the border been affected by partition? How much do the two sides share in common, and what distinctions have emerged? And the reference point here is in thinking about East and West Germany, and then its later unification.
So I think, I mean, Sarah, I think you can speak to this as well, linguistically especially, that there's so much, all of the Northwest belt of India and Pakistan share. And language automatically, informs our understanding of food. It becomes the songs we sing. It becomes the lullabies we know, the idioms and phrases we use. So it's that intimate. It's on that sort of granular level that I could say something in Bombay and somebody in Karachi says the exact same thing. So we have that bond in common, which is why there is a lot of, like, especially theater, music, they constantly go across the border, and there's a lot of trying to bring people together. I think in terms of distinctions, I'm not the best informed, I think, to really speak on it, but I do feel like India has still at least tried to maintain the idea of being a secular, multi-faith, multi-ethnic country. And Pakistan has that too. It has a very rich and multifaceted population, but I'd say it just went there earlier, and India is sort of following suit, where we're essentially trying to become a monolith. And in Pakistan too, you've had leaders who've tried to make it this monolith in terms of one religion, one subsect of the religion is the majority and sort of higher up in the food chain in that sense. And India, unfortunately, is undergoing the same sort of transformation. I would say America is too, in some sense. But I think that has been the distinction, at least for me, and I'm very biased as an Indian Muslim. I have always felt that India at least tried to protect our multi-ethnic syncreticity as a country for very long.
Great. Thank you, Zara. So we will, there are many people expressing their gratitude and thanks in the chat, and unfortunately we don't have time for any additional questions, but I do want to add very quickly before we close that Iris has an upcoming human rights speaker online series. So Monday, November 30th from 2:30 to 3:30, there will be a series on refugee youth citizenship, education, and exclusion from public schooling. And then next month's Iris International Book Club event, which will be Wednesday, December 2nd from 3 to 4 p.m., we'll discuss a film, and the topic is From Local to Global, Promoting Community Immunity in the Time of COVID. There is also a book club event on Tuesday, December 8th from 3 to 4, and the book will be When Stars Are Scattered. So I believe all of that information will be not only on the IRIS website, but you will also receive this information in the follow-up email tomorrow. So with that, I would like it if everyone could please help me thank our wonderful speaker once again, and please feel free to unmute yourself and to just say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Zara.
So much.
Awesome.
So much, Zara.
Fantastic.